Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. Episode 14: God doesn't grant wishes. Hello everyone, and thank you for listening. A few weeks ago I had to cross Spain in order to go from Portugal to France. That was a beautiful drive as you passed through barren landscapes and arid mountains. At some point the sky was very cloudy, but in the distance there was a pool of light, highlighting an empty land that was hidden behind a hill. Now let's imagine for a second that we live in ancient times, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. We used to get our water from the same spot for our families, our tribes, and also our livestock. But this year, the river is dry, so we have to move. We have to go further through land we do not know, taking the risk of being attacked by other tribes and losing our food to wild animals. Remember that at this time we have no map and there is no road, so the progression is slow and dangerous. Also, our knowledge in science is almost non-existent. So when we see a ray of sunshine coming down through the clouds, while everything around is dark and grim, it's obvious that we're going to head towards the land that is below the sunlight. When you're lost in nature, it's what you do. You trust your instinct and you follow some unusual landmarks because why not? Now when we arrive there where the sun was pointing, after walking for hours and climbing the hill, we finally find a river with beautiful clear blue water. Imagine that you're in that situation at that time. What would you think? Isn't it natural to think that someone or something, like a divine force, guided you towards this stream? So now that our tribe can drink clean water and that our animals are healthy again, we celebrate. We realize that we're not alone and that there is an entity that helped us. We are grateful. Then a year passes and our river gets dry. We see a light in the distance, so we follow it once again, and we find another source of water. We're starting to pray for the river to keep flowing all over the year. We invent myth. We give a personality to the sun, to the light, and to all the elements. We're beginning to trust in something we don't see. But a year later, there is no light. Half our animals die, and we are all thirsty. Did we do something different? Should we pray differently, or maybe we should have sacrificed one of our beasts and through the liberation of a soul, we could have reached God to thank Him. Sacrificing one animal to ensure the well-being of others seems a fair idea, so we do that. A few days later, the sun, once again, leads us to another river, and everything is good again. The sacrifice becomes a ritual, and every time there is rain, it's a sign that God appreciates our gift. After a few days at our new spot, we realize the water is foul. Our newborns die, everyone is sick, it's a catastrophe. And the weather gets unusually hot. The sun that we thought was our ally is now drying all the streams we ever know. We're beginning to starve and we lose hope. There are now two groups in our tribe. One thinks that we have not been fervent enough in our rituals. The other one thinks that we're praying to the wrong God. So what do? We fight each other, because how can we live together if we keep having arguments and if we can never agree on any decision? Without an ideological foundation, the tribe collapses. After some time and many disasters, it seems obvious for some of us that God is unfair. Why do our babies die? Why did the fire destroy our dwellings? Why is it so cold this year, and why is the harvest so bad? But there is another interpretation to make out of those dramatic events. God might be unfair, but instead of lamenting and complaining, we should adapt to the new path He puts us on. The old spots might be dry, but we need to move on because this is the only viable solution. Now you might think that today science has brought us many answers so that we don't need God anymore. And I won't argue with that. This is not the point of this episode. But you should keep in mind that your existence is full of beliefs. It's not only about our lack of answers, it's also because we have our lifestyle, our culture, our principles, and our pride. Throughout the history of humanity, we have gone through disasters, but we have survived thanks to our beliefs. To kill God, as Nietzsche said, is to be ignorant of the reasons that pushed us to build our society. Why is that? Because when you believe in God, you believe in a specific cosmogony that shapes your lifestyle. I don't think we can believe in God without the theology and the religion that goes with Him. There might be a God, but there are many ways to believe and worship Him. One could even say that we all worship God in a different way, but the core beliefs are the same. We respect the laws of God. Why does the Old Testament have so many laws? Because God was not only revealed for solving individual crises, it was first and foremost to build a community and to have a frame inside which we could prosper. I'm convinced that without laws, we would all become ruthless beasts again. And here I'm talking about ancient laws, because it's obvious that today some of them are abusive. Let's imagine for a moment that my children are starving and that all my crops died. If I see that the other tribe living nearby had a fruitful harvest, and if there are no laws, what forbids me to kill my neighbor in order to feed my family? And what forbids them to take vengeance and act with cruelty so that I won't react? At some point in history, we had to create laws that would appear legitimate to everyone. And if we can all reach virtue today without needing the fear of God or the fear of punishment, it's because of those ancient laws. The Bible was written as a book of laws to federate, appease, and reassure. It is a collection of oral teachings, letters, and books, in the same way as the Talmud is the collection of thoughts from thousands of rabbis spread over more than 5 centuries. Believing in God is not only about your own salvation, it's also about believing in those laws as they constitute the foundations of the society we choose to live in. When humans were too numerous to live in caves, and when hunting and foraging was not enough to feed everyone, they had to go out and create communities in order to survive. They had to adapt to a new lifestyle. They had to plant, to take care of the land, to domesticate animals, and to pray and worship in the hope of a good harvest. But there were many problems, like eating raw meat, drinking blood, poor hygiene, self-inflicted pain, sacrifices of children, rapes, violence, and many other things that could only destroy the community eventually. In the Old Testament, the Mesopotamians are a constant target. They worship false gods and they don't have proper laws. So I think the main objective of those who wrote the Old Testament was exactly to solve all the problems that a lawless community would generate. And to achieve that, they needed to make sure that everyone would recognize a supreme authority. Some of the laws that you can read in the Old Testament are still applied today, and they're even considered as common sense. Have you ever wondered why you don't covet the partner of your best friend? They might be prettier, more successful, and even kinder, but still, you know it's bad. And not only for ethical reasons, you don't even conceive the idea, because it makes sense not to. But at this time, it was not so obvious, and the Old Testament is a beautiful testimony of how humans lived in those ancient times. For example, in Genesis 20, Abraham has to pretend that his wife is his sister, because she's so pretty that he's scared that others might kill him to get her. It sounds crazy today, but don't think for 1 second that those people were utterly different from us. We might have electricity and artificial intelligence, but we still have the potential to do evil in order to impose our ideas and fulfill our desires. If you don't understand how bad you can be, you will end up with prejudice against everyone who has a different opinion than yours, and you might follow a dark path thinking that you're free to do so. How can you indeed avoid becoming bad if you're not aware of what bad really means? Most of us are well educated, we have morals, it's imposed on us from our young age. But if we didn't have this education, how could you convince someone that laws are good for them? You had to have a supreme form of authority, and also the idea of an afterlife where you would be judged for all your actions. In the Bible, Cain kills Abel because God favors his brother without any obvious reasons. This seems absolutely arbitrary, but yet very credible because it's exactly how life works. Life is unfair, and if you keep victimizing yourself, you'll never move on. One of the most important teachings of the Bible is that life is made of a lot of suffering, and you shouldn't add any to yourself. Suffering is eventually beneficial because it makes us accept life as it is. It makes us move forward instead of being passive all our life, just feeding on regrets, resentment, and sorrow. In one word, suffering makes us wise. The Church was wrong when it encouraged suffering for centuries, as it's not what it said in the Bible. Accepting suffering is about accepting the road that is in front of you instead of always trying to change your past. And there's a lot more pain coming for you if you don't accept that life isn't fair. So Cain should have accepted that his path was not the same as its brother's. One might say that he had another destiny, or that God had other plans for him. But he failed. He chose murder over patience and faith. And like Dostoevsky shows in Crime and Punishment, when you kill someone, you kill a part of yourself, while the other part is plagued by guilt. God's laws are here to remind us that we have built communities in order to live in peace and to allow all individuals to have a decent life. And we cannot live in peace without those laws. We cannot even be free without those laws, as we cannot escape from our remorse. After this episode comes the flood. Because of Cain and the wickedness of man, God is disappointed in humans and wants to start again. In Genesis 8:21, he says, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood." But don't take this out of context. The Old Testament is a story about creation, and when you create, you evolve. And in the Old Testament, God himself is growing like we all do. When he says that the human heart is evil from childhood, the law does not exist yet. The flood is God's mistake, believing that there was no hope for mankind. What really saves mankind is not the flood, but the law, as told in the story of Moses. It's by amending a system that you fix its flaws, and not by destroying everything, hoping to start from scratch. Laws and rules have allowed tribes to evolve into a bigger and more cohesive form of community. That's why in the Old Testament a whole book is dedicated to laws, and why in the Jewish tradition the Talmud is so important. And in the Quran, God's laws are one of the first topics that is brought to light, started from the second surah. You might ask yourself, why do we need God to make laws? Because for many people, God is the ultimate authority. He is the judge, and there is nothing above him. He is the origin of everything. Without the stories of God and how vengeful he can be, who is going to impose rules on others? Who is legitimate to do that in a time of tribes and internal struggles? The problem is we have divided the world and we still live in times of struggle. And I actually think we are still a group of tribes fighting each other for a bit of land, as we keep repeating the same pattern even today. We often fight for reasons that I think are very much anti-religious. And if you think that religion is actually the cause of war, it's because you don't understand how fundamental the religious questions are, and how much of your culture is actually coming from those questions. If it wasn't for religious ideas, be sure that we would fight each other for other reasons. War does not bring peace and does not bring cohesion. But we will always be the same humans, and we will always have inside us the potentiality to act like Cain. Is it a reason to despair, to become cynical and bitter, and to even hate humans? Absolutely not. It's a reason to understand the value of virtue and the necessity of cohesion. Nobody should actually speak in the name of God, as the idea of a divine authority is to get the best out of us. God is supposed to help you to understand yourself and to understand life, and if you do, you will do no harm. We might have the potential to be Cain, but we also have the potential to be Abel. Whether or not you need God to reach this understanding is a question we should all ask ourselves. And don't underestimate the question, do you believe in God? As there are actually three questions there. Firstly, who is you? Secondly, what is the meaning of believing? And finally, what God are we talking about? And if you believe in God, do you believe in religion? If so, how do you define religion? Can you even believe in any God if you don't believe in the doctrine and the theology that your God is based on? Many Christians believe in God but don't believe in their religion. At least they don't believe in the form of power that emerged from their religion. But obviously most believers agree on the core principles that are taught in the Holy Scripture. Although to me it seems quite contradictory to not believe in the religion of your God. The Bible is a compilation of texts. That means that Christianity chooses what text would be canon and what text would be apocryphal. For instance, in the Gospel of Judas, Judas asked Jesus if the human spirit dies when the body dies, to which Jesus says yes. Another example in the same Gospel is about Adam and Eve. Unlike in Genesis, both are created by the angels of chaos and the kings of Hades, and it's God himself who gives them knowledge in order for the kings of Hades to not rule over him. You see here a reference of a Greek myth that has been removed from the official text. If Christianity had evolved differently, other people would have been in charge, and maybe another cosmogony would have been selected. When we look at how much our lifestyle throughout the world has changed in just a few decades, it's hard to comprehend why the Bible, which is a compilation of books from different times, is so coherent. That's obviously because a lot of work had been put into it, and not only at one single time, but at several occurrences and over a few centuries. What is acceptable today was reprehensible 3 centuries ago, and no matter what your interpretation of the Bible is, there will always be a form of authority, like the Vatican, who has the final say. Now I would like to talk about the origin of this authority. One very important part of any religion is writing. If we hadn't invented writing about 5,000 years ago, there would be no means to spread ideas other than oral transmission. When we look at a book today, our perception is completely different from what it was 2,000 years ago. Writing and oral transmission cohabited for centuries even after Jesus, as some Jewish sects would favor oral transmission over writing. It was the case of the Pharisees, for instance. When you read a book today, you expect it to conform to a certain standard because literature has evolved in a certain way. For example, you expect rationality and quotes from a history book, and you would like the author to always reveal their sources. But when you listen to a storyteller, you're not only there for the content, you're also there for the poetry of the words, for the intonation, and the personal approach of the storyteller. 1,000 copies of the same book will always tell the same story, but 1,000 people will never exactly say the same thing. And that's because when someone speaks, his intentions are betrayed by his body movement. What he's telling is not only about words or not only about their meaning. There's an envelope around, something that is very much open to interpretation, but that can speak to everyone, even those who don't understand the story itself. When someone tells a joke at a family meal, there's always one person who doesn't really understand it, but is amused nonetheless because the way the story is told is funny. When you listen to someone declaiming poetry in a language that you don't know, you can still appreciate it, because even though you don't understand the words, you hear the melody. With oral transmission, the storyteller is part of the story. He gesticulates, he changes his voice, his intonations, he emphasizes on the right parts depending on how he wants to impact his audience. His presence is enough to inspire them, and the story itself might actually only be secondary. I think there's a comparison possible between a healer, like a shaman, and a storyteller. They are both here to take care of you, to appease your soul. The story that is told is not only for your ears or for your mind, it also has a deep impact that has something to do with the alchemy of face-to-face human communication. Now, if you think that the Bible is wrong because the historicity of Jesus is debatable, or because there is obviously no bearded man in the clouds, you clearly don't understand the value of a story, especially at the times the Bible has been written. We live in an age where reason must prevail and conclusions and solutions must be found for every problem we have. I believe that the Bible was never written to actually offer a permanent solution to the origin of everything, and that due to popular superstitions, we focused more on the myth of the Bible rather than its philosophical parts. The Greeks believed in their gods, but never they would have expected to see them in the sky. They found entertainment in the fable part of the story, but most of them still understood the allegorical parts. One does not dismiss the other. And when you tell a story that is supposed to educate and entertain at the same time, you make up a few things to make it more real. You embellish, you enhance. Besides, the parchment on which you will write your story takes a week to make and is therefore very expensive. And making a copy of your book will have the same cost because there was no printing. So you wouldn't write something that is not well thought on a parchment. It needed to be perfect. The Dead Sea Scrolls found in Qumran are one of the many proofs we have that shows that the Bible has been modified at several occasions, probably by a few copyists who either had received instructions from religious authority or had taken the liberty of putting a bit of their own faith into the final text. We also know that some references to biblical events have been added to some historical books that were supposed to remain impartial, like those written by Flavius Josephus and Tacitus. But does this alter the value of the Bible? Of course not. The allegories of the Bible are powerful, and no matter what myth you put around, they will always remain powerful because they're talking about humans and therefore they are timeless. I personally believe that the Bible was written by people who had a very clear view of what humans are capable of, and their intention was to save mankind from self-destruction or at least to drastically improve their condition. You don't need to believe in any biblical events to actually understand the meanings of their message. There is a theory about the Dead Sea Scrolls of Qumran that advances the idea that some books of the Bible have been written by the Essenes. The Essenes were a Jewish sect who live in Judea, which is a strip of land that was later renamed Syria-Palestina by the Romans. Those people probably lived in very isolated communities, far from the Romans, far from power, and that would explain their ways of thinking. Objectivity always depends on collective beliefs. What is objective for some is not for others, so naturally, if you live isolated from the rest of the world, the nature of your opinions might be totally new, if not strange, to someone living within a bigger society. It's also interesting to look at Judea at that time. In the west you have the Egyptians, and in the east the Mesopotamians. They had no way of fighting those two powerful empires, and spreading ideas is sometimes more efficient than going into battle. I think that because writing was becoming more and more popular, but that books were very expensive to produce, there was a collective project to write one book that would condense and gather whole human knowledge like an encyclopedia. Until that time, we had what we could call conceptual characters. Those characters, historical or not, were given a certain philosophy like Plato did with Socrates. But before Plato and the invention of writing, we can easily imagine that storytellers would use those characters to give more credibility to their stories. And I think that's how Christianity emerged, not because of the Bible at first, but because of storytelling. Remember that Jesus, Buddha, and Socrates never wrote a single book, but yet their influences are incalculable. I think that to understand society and mankind, we need to understand religion, and more specifically how religion can evolve into a dominating form of power. Jesus himself couldn't have built Christianity, as he was against power and actually against religion. He was a rebel, and that's why he got crucified, because sedition was a serious crime, especially at this time where the Romans were trying to get complete control of Jewish territory. In Matthew 23, Jesus says, "The teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses. So practice and obey whatever they tell you, but don't follow their example, for they don't practice what they teach. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden." The Pharisees were one of the two main Jewish schools of thought, the other major one being the Sadducees. Some believe today that Jesus was from a minor group, the Essenes, who might have been serious contributors to the Bible, according to the discoveries that have been made in the caves of Qumran. It's important to understand that those times were difficult times where ancient religions and practices were questioned by many prophets. Those prophets had followers, and some of them were brave enough to openly show their aversion against the power in place. But the Romans were in charge, even though they would respect the judgment of the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish assembly for justice. The Christians were the name given to the followers of Jesus, and this name only appeared after Jesus' death. In the first chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, 13-15, it is said, "In those days Peter stood up among the believers, a group numbering about 120. So the number of followers of Jesus during his life was actually quite low. You wouldn't be able to convince the Romans to change their religion with so few people. So what happened? I believe that Jesus existed, as it actually causes more problems to say that he didn't. But I also believe that his death was not an important event at his time, and that the movement of the Christians was one movement amongst others that the Romans and the Jews quickly dismissed because they had other problems. In the year 70, the siege of Jerusalem put an end to the period of the Second Temple. This was the end of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and this event had a deep impact on Jewish identity. Now to me this is interesting because a Messiah never arrives in easy times. A Messiah arrives in dark times where everything seems hopeless. Imagine how brutal the Roman invasion must have been. The goal was to destroy Judaism, but of course, you cannot destroy a religion by just killing their representatives. There is no reference of a Messiah in the Old Testament, and only someone influential enough could have come with this idea, as it was a terrible period for the Jews. The Pharisees, very much opposed to the Sadducees, were the first persecutors of the Christians. They were an influential populist group that had very low tolerance for any other little sect. One of those persecutors was Saul of Tarsus, better known today as Saint Paul. He was a powerful man, stoic, very influential, and said himself that before his revelation he would persecute Christians beyond measure. He was a fanatic, and he would have defended his order at all costs. So how do you become a faithful apostle of a religious group that you hate? Why would you even betray your own people? Well, with the Romans being more and more aggressive and powerful, it was obvious that his order was going to fail both politically and religiously. He understood that if he wanted to keep his influence, he had to either join another group, but there was none, or to create his own. And after the death of Jesus, the Christians very likely grew stronger, so it seems perfectly credible that he invented his big revelation to save his power, as he knew the Christians very well. Of course, if we believe the Bible, he then got persecuted himself and arrested, then executed by Nero, who was persecuting the Christians. I personally don't believe so much in the systematic persecution of Christians, as those martyrdom stories don't make much sense. At least I believe those persecutions were later very much exaggerated by the Church, as it seemed that it was not only the Christians who got persecuted, but all religions that were not respecting the Roman traditions and gods. Tacitus said that Rome was full of cults, and that it was actually the cause of its decline. In his book, The Annals, he says the following: Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and most mischievous superstition, thus checked for a moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. You have to remember that it was a time where it was believed that some people could read into the future. So there was obviously a lot of different beliefs and no serious science to discredit the fanciest superstitions. Anyway, what is important about St. Paul is that one man can give so much influence to an idea that would probably have been forgotten otherwise. As you know, a few centuries later, Constantine made Christianism the official religion of the Romans. So Christianity didn't impose itself in one day. It took centuries and a lot of denial, violence, and atrocities. When Constantine decided to be a good Christian, after having killed his wife and his son, it was probably for his own salvation and not so much for Rome. Imagine indeed that you can still go to heaven after having killed your loved ones. You would do everything to show your good faith to everyone. And you would even make sure that the superstitions you believe in are believed by many. If there was indeed a risk of burning in the flames of hell for eternity after our death, I'm sure we would all try everything we can to avoid that. Without the Romans, there would be no Christianity as we know it today. What makes a cult a religion is how power uses it. Christianity as a form of power is based on lies that a few madmen told to save their own interest, very often in complete contradiction to the teachings of Jesus. New forms of religion always come out in dark times where old religions are badly used to control people. Jesus was a son of God, understand a son of mankind, because like Muhammad 600 centuries later, he believed in the core principles of religion and wouldn't admit the corruption that was ongoing around it. There is rarely any demonstration of peace in the history of Christianity, but yet our core laws are the same that are found in the Old Testament, and many of our traditions and morals are Christians. Religion and God are two different things, and even though without God there cannot be a religion, many people believe in God without identifying with a religion. All kinds of beliefs were accepted as long as they were based on stories that were told around a fire. There was a consensus around them, even if people knew that an important part of the stories were part of the storytelling. Things actually got bad when details started to matter. Every little word then became a reason to argue, and the core messages faded into ridiculous quarrels, like the ones the Church had during the Inquisition or before from other groups like the Gnostics. The more we go into details, the further away we go from the essential. When it takes you all day to get water, gather food, and cut wood, you don't really have time to challenge your beliefs. It's not even in your mind. But religion became a greedy power, and stories once told around the fire had to be taken seriously. Storytellers died, and myth became superstitions, and symbols became miracles. Nowadays, we have so little trust in each other that every fact is doubted, and personal experience seems more important than collective experience. What's the main argument of people who believe that Earth is flat? It's because they don't feel gravity, so for them, if there's no empirical proof, then it's a lie. The problem with that logic is that society loses its meaning. If everyone invents their own founding myth because they realize the official one is ambiguous, then there is no possible cohesion. And of course, when the official one is presented as the only truth, then it is also a problem. In ancient times, there was not so much dichotomy between truth and false. Every story was in a grey area, and nobody was feeling that they were lied to. The gods of the Greeks didn't really have to exist for the population to believe in them. The mythology was beyond truth, and they knew that truth, as the essence of everything, was simply unreachable to humanity. And it's not because they were polytheistic. We actually have the wrong idea when it comes to understanding polytheism. In every polytheism, there is very often one god who dominates all others. And those other gods are sometimes just a representation or a form of a single divinity that is too complex to understand otherwise. Besides, in polytheistic religions, people generally choose to worship only one divinity. Monotheism might have a different approach, but the reasons that push mankind to worship a god are always the same. There are indeed good reasons to believe in God, like the fear of death and love, of course, translated from the word agape in Greek, but they're not the only ones. For instance, have you ever thought about the origin of your intuitions and your dreams, and how they can both impact your decision-making in your daily life? Have you ever thought about what makes us what we want? And then what about free will, acceptance, art, fear, guilt, or forgiveness? Why do we find reasons to live, and why is it not only about survival and reproduction? Ask yourself those questions, because if you say you don't believe in God, you better have good answers to those. Of course, there are many ways of seeing God. There is God who creates, God who justifies, and God who guides. Then you have the Bible, with all those beautiful allegories that you can still refer to without even believing in God. Many philosophers had to hide their true beliefs during their existence because either they were anti-clerical or considered immoral. For example, Montaigne was against Christianity as a form of power, and for Spinoza, God was just the origin of everything, like a mathematical explanation more than a conscious entity. For me, God is like a human essence that lets you go through the sufferings of life with a gentle touch. He's an inner force that makes every torment lighter. God is our imagination, our ideas, and all life at the same time. Fair, unfair, He is life as we need to accept it. Spirits are ideas that survive death. That's the canon of Christianism, and where the notion of paradise comes from. But I think the actual paradise is inside you. It's how you perceive the world, and true miracle is happiness. Our loved ones that we lost are in paradise because we allow them to go there. They are inside us, in our soul, because that way we can still feel them. And on the other hand, if you make yourself miserable, you will know hell, as hell can be here and now, on this planet, except if you learn to avoid its many traps. And if you don't, you'll face Judgment Day, which is your last day as a human on this planet, and to which there are no other judges than yourself, as you are your most cruel judge. It is very easy to hate ourselves, and this is what I think could be called hell. God is sometimes the healthiest explanation, because then we don't need to go through hell to try to understand and justify our behavior. We just accept and submit without regrets or resentment. God made us imperfect. We must be aware of this imperfection and accept it. Otherwise, we would have prejudice against everyone and everything we don't understand, and we could become what we are not aware of. How can you indeed avoid committing murder if you don't understand how bad this is and why? I believe that God is not an answer, and is not a fact or a proof either, but He is a key, and He can either unlock many things for you or none. We often believe that Western philosophy started with Thales, but then philosophy was not really about wisdom, humility, or common sense. It was more about abstracting our existence and sublimating our true nature. For instance, Thales believed that everything was water. But how does water change into solid materials? Where does it come from? Can it be the source of our imagination? Those questions were actually irrelevant. Water was a key, not an answer. Our obsessions of always wanting to find answers is actually quite new when you look at human history. Even in ancient Greece, answers were not a priority. What was the priority was to live actively, with practical common sense, even if it would be unreasonable. The cynics, for instance, like Diogenes of Sinope, believed that dogs were models because they live in the present, they don't care about the origin of the universe, and they forgive and forget. For a cynic, language is a tool, a means to an end, and all explanations are futile. Of course, the cynics never wrote anything, and most of what we know about them comes from anecdotes. I believe that the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, started the same way, without any desire to ever put words on paper. Another group of people with other intentions decided that those stories should be spread and wrote them down, but writing changed the way we believed in them, and I think it even altered their meaning. After editing, copying, and translating, those stories became precious, and then everything had to be rationalized, and there was no room for doubts anymore. We then started to overanalyze every word, even though many translations were inaccurate. For instance, in the Gospel of Judas, which is not canonized, the word daemon is translated as spirit by mayor, then as God by king. It's obviously a huge difference, as daemon in Greek is the embodiment of an idea, a true spirit, and was later associated with evil by the Christians. Of course, there are many examples of how translations might have altered the intention of the original version of the text. The serpent in Genesis, for example, is more likely to be the representation of our desires, even our creativity, than to just be a snake. But the snake is a primitive fear to all apes, so when you read Genesis, it's easy to see this animal instead of an abstraction of our own nature. I won't go further into this topic as this episode is already very long, but to everyone who wants to understand the Bible, I would recommend that you listen to those interviews of linguists who actually studied the Old Testament in Hebrew and also know other ancient languages. And if you never read the Bible, I'll put a few links down below to some website I particularly like. Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode.